I have buried better men than I deserve to have known, and I have stood at attention for a few I should have buried sooner, and in 40 years of doing this I learned to tell those two kinds apart inside a week. So when they sent us a new shooter at the tail end of a bad summer, and she stepped off the resupply bird at Greyridge with her gear bag over one shoulder and her rifle case in her other hand and the dust still hanging behind the rotors, I had already decided what she was before she'd taken 6 steps on my ridge. I was wrong. I want that said plainly and up front because I have spent the years since being wrong about almost nothing else, and a man who tells you a story like this one ought to start by admitting where he was a fool. I was the senior sniper on that ridge. I was the range authority for the whole sector. Whatever those men shot, I had signed for it. Whatever they knew, I had taught them. And the day Sergeant Wren Calder arrived at Outpost Greyridge, I looked at her and saw a clerk, and I handed her a logbook, and I told my section she was there to keep score. Greyridge was a hard place to be sent. It sat on a long spine of rock above a valley the maps gave some forgettable grid name to, and that everyone who lived up there called the Long Saddle, because of the way it dipped and rose between 2 shoulders of mountain and ran flat and pale for the better part of 4 kilometers before it climbed again into the far ridges. We held the high ground. That sounds like an advantage, and it was, but the saddle was a killing floor that cut both ways, and the far ridges across it were honeycombed with positions we could see and never quite reach. The enemy had owned that country longer than any of us had been soldiers. They knew the wind in that valley the way I knew the back of my own hand, and the wind in that valley was a living thing. It came up the saddle in the morning and rolled down it in the afternoon and switched directions in the gut of the thing where the 2 shoulders pinched, so that a round fired across it had to be argued with the whole way. We were a scout sniper section, 8 of us before Calder, plus the line platoon that held the wire. We ran overwatch for the patrols and the convoys that moved through the lower valley, and we ran the hide that looked down the length of the saddle, and once a week or so we earned our pay. My best shooter was a staff sergeant named Prout, and I'll tell you about Prout honestly because he matters to this. Prout was the finest natural marksman I had put my hands on in 15 years of teaching. He had a gift. He could read a target and break a shot faster than thought, and on a good day, with the wind behaving, he could put a round into a man's chest at 1100 meters and never seem to try. He knew he was good. That was the trouble with him. He had never once been humbled, and a shooter who has never been humbled carries his confidence like a loaded weapon with the safety off. The 2 of us watched her come up the path from the LZ. She was not a big woman. She moved without hurry, which I noted and dismissed, because in that country slow was how the new ones moved before they learned the difference between calm and stupid. She had a plain, weathered face and pale eyes that went over the ridge and the wire and the far ground in a way I should have recognized and didn't. The way a shooter's eyes go over ground, taking the ranges and the dead spots and the angles without being told to. Her hair was cropped and going gray at the temple, though she couldn't have been past her late 30s. She wore the same dust everybody wore up there, and she carried her rifle case the way some men carry a sleeping child, and I saw that and I thought, somebody told her that's how you're supposed to look. "Sergeant Calder," she said when she reached us, reporting in. "Top Conroy," I said, "this is Staff Sergeant Prout, your admin. I want you to sit with that question because it tells you everything about the man I was that afternoon." She had a rifle in her hand. Her name was on my section's manifest as a shooter, and I looked at her and asked if she was admin, because some part of me had already filed her under the heading of things that were not real shooters, and that part of me was running my mouth before the rest of me had thought. She didn't bristle. That was the first thing about her that should have warned me and didn't. A new soldier who is what she's supposed to be, you doubt her out loud and she gets her back up. She's young and proud, and she hasn't learned yet that proving it with your mouth costs you everything. Calder just looked at me for a moment with those pale eyes and said, "I'm a shooter, Top. Section says you needed a long gun." "We've got long guns," Prout said. He said it easy, smiling, and that was worse than if he'd snarled it. "We've got the best long gun in the sector. What we could use is somebody to run the book." He nodded at the data book and the spotting log we kept up in the hide, the running record of every engagement, the dope, the calls, the corrections. "You read Mills, you can read Mills, you'd actually be useful." I should have stopped it there. I was the senior man. It was my section and my ridge and my responsibility, and a section takes its temperature from the man at the top, and I had set the temperature the second I asked her if she was admin. So when Prout walked her up to the hide and dumped her gear bag off the firing platform and into the dirt at the back, not rough, just careless, the way you move a sandbag that was in your way, and handed her the logbook and said, "You can keep score for us, sweetheart, watch how it's done," I did not stop that either. I stood at the back of the hide and I let it happen, and I told myself it was how the section worked, that everybody earned their spot, that she'd shoot when she'd shown she could keep up. She picked her bag up out of the dirt without a word. She set it down again at the back of the platform, squared away, and she took the logbook from Prout and she opened it and she began to read. Now I have to tell you about the logbook because the logbook is where I should have seen it, days before I finally did. A sniper's data book is the most honest document a soldier keeps. It is not a journal, it is a ledger of truth. Every shot, every range, every wind call, every correction, every hit and every miss written down so that the next time the conditions repeat you do not have to guess. A lazy shooter keeps a thin book full of his good days. A great shooter keeps a thick book full of his bad ones because the bad ones are where the data lives. I had been reading men's data books my whole career, and you can tell more about a shooter from his book than from watching him shoot, because shooting is theater and the book is the bones underneath. Calder kept score for us for 2 days, and on the morning of the third I came up into the hide before dawn and found her already there, sitting cross-legged at the back with our section logbook open on her knee and a notebook of her own beside it. And I saw this and didn't understand what I was seeing. She had been rebuilding our range card. A range card was a sketch of the saddle and the far ridges with the known distances marked, the reference points, the dead ground, the gun positions we'd identified, the lanes. Every section keeps one. Ours was good. I'd built most of it myself over a year of sitting in that hide. And Calder in 2 days of keeping score had quietly drawn her own over the top of ours, and hers was not good. Hers was a different order of thing entirely. She had ranged points I had never bothered to range because I had written them off as too far to matter. She had marked the place in the gut of the saddle where the wind switched, and she had marked it not as a line but as a zone, with notes on what the mirage did there at different hours. She had a column down the side of her notebook of densities and temperatures, and the times she'd read them. She had been reading the air for 2 days the way the rest of us read it for 30 seconds before a shot. "What's all this?" I said. She didn't startle, she looked up. "Homework," she said. "Hope you don't mind, your card's good for inside 2000, past that it gets thin." She said it without an ounce of challenge in it, the way you'd tell a man his boot was untied. "Past 2000 this valley does things, I wanted to understand it before it mattered." "Nothing past 2000 matters," I said. "Past 2000's the far ridge, we don't shoot the far ridge, can't reach it clean, we shoot the saddle." She looked at me a moment, then she looked back down at her notebook and she made a small mark in it and she said, "All right, top," and that was all. I want you to understand that this should have ended it, a man with any sense. Finding a clerk had quietly built the finest range card he'd ever seen in 2 days off a borrowed logbook, would have stopped and asked himself a question. I did not ask myself the question. I walked back out of the hide and I told Prout the new one had been doodling on our range card, and Prout laughed and I laughed, and that is the part of this I have never forgiven myself for, not the first afternoon. A man can be a fool for an afternoon. The third morning, with the proof of her open on her knee in front of me that I should have seen. The days went on, she kept the book. She glassed for us and she was the best spotter any of us had ever worked with, which we attributed to her being a careful sort of person, good with details, the kind of trait you valued in support staff. When Prout made a shot she'd call the correction before the dust settled and she'd have it right, and Prout started to rely on her calls, the way you rely on a good instrument, and it never once occurred to him that an instrument doesn't make calls like that, that only another shooter, a better one, reads wind and trace and impact the way she was reading it. He thought he had a gifted clerk. He had a master sitting at his elbow correcting his homework, and he never knew because she never once let him know. That was the thing about her I came to understand much later, and it took me years to stop being ashamed of how long it took. She was not waiting for her moment to humiliate us. She was not bidding her time to throw it in our faces. She had simply decided that the work was the work, and that the book needed keeping and the wind needed reading whether or not the men around her knew what she was. And so she kept the book and read the wind and built her card and said all right, top, when I was a fool to her. And she did it without rage and without sulking and without one single time reaching for the credit that was hers. I have known a great many brave men. I have known very few that humble. The two are rarer together than people think. Once, only once in those weeks I saw a crack in it, and even then she sealed it over so fast I half believed I'd imagined it. Prout had missed a shot, a real miss, an embarrassing one, 800 meters on a still morning, and he'd blamed the rifle, the way a proud shooter does, and he'd handed it back to her to check the zero with a sneer like the rifle was a thing she might understand. And she had taken it, and she looked down the length of it, and for just 1 second something passed across her face. Not anger, recognition. The look of a person who has handled 10,000 rifles and knows in her hands exactly what this one will do and exactly why the man holding it had missed. Then it was gone and she said the zero was fine, Staff Sergeant. Maybe the wind picked up off the rock and she gave it back, and Prout nodded like she'd confirmed his story. She had given him his pride back, he never knew she'd handed it to him. Then came the morning of the long saddle, and everything I knew about who was who on that ridge came apart in the space of one engagement. It started the way the bad ones always start, with a radio call that turns the air in the hide to glass. There was a recon element out 22 men, a reinforced patrol that had gone down into the lower valley 2 days before to map a route and had been working their way back up toward us along the floor of the long saddle. They were good men. I knew their lieutenant. And just past dawn, in the gut of the saddle in the worst possible place, they walked into it. The enemy had set the ambush the way only people who own the ground can set one. They had let the patrol get all the way into the pinch, where the two shoulders of mountain squeezed the valley narrow and the dead ground gave the patrol nowhere to go. And then they opened up from 3 positions at once, 3 crude machine guns dug into the far ridge, interlocking with grazing fire that swept the whole floor of the saddle, and pinned 22 men flat in a dry wash with no way forward and no way back. And then, while the guns held them down, the enemy did the thing that told me these were not farmers with rifles. They put a counter-sniper to work, a good one. He started picking off the men who tried to move, one at a time, patient, taking the radio operator first and then the lieutenant second, and the patrol went still in the wash because every man who lifted his head got around through it. We could see all of it. That was the unbearable part. From the height at Grayridge, we had a clean line down the length of the saddle to the pinch and the far ridge beyond it. And through our glass we watched 22 men get nailed to the floor of that valley, and we watched the puffs of the gun positions, and we watched a man here and a man there stop moving, and the whole thing was happening at the far end of the saddle, on and past the far ridge. Past 2,000 meters, the gun positions were at 2,800. The counter-sniper, when we finally found his hide, was at 3,200. Out past where I had told Calder nothing mattered. I put Prout on the gun. He was my best, and this was the moment a section exists for, and he got behind the long rifle and I spotted for him and he tried. I will give him this, he tried, and he was not a coward, and a lesser shooter would not even have attempted it. He dialed everything he had and he sent a round at the near gun position at 2,800 meters, and we watched through the glass and the round fell short and right, a long way short, kicking up dust 200 meters this side of the gun, and the gun kept hammering the wash full of our men. He corrected and fired again, short and left. The wind in the gut of the saddle, the switching wind, the thing Calder had drawn as a zone and not a line, took his rounds and threw them away, and Prout did not know the wind in that part of the valley because he had never bothered to learn it, because nothing past 2,000 mattered. He fired 6 rounds. None of them came inside 50 meters of a gun. And down in the wash men were dying, and the lieutenant's voice was on the radio now, not panicked, worse than panicked, that flat calm a good officer gets when he knows the math is against him, asking for the overwatch to do something, anything, and the overwatch could not reach. Prout came off the gun white in the face. I can't make it top, he said. It's too far, the wind in the middle, I can't read it, nobody can read it, it's too far. And a voice behind us said quietly, I can read it. I turned around, Calder was already moving. She had the logbook closed and set aside, and she had her own rifle case open. I had never once seen her open it. It had sat in the dirt at the back of that hide for weeks, and I had assumed it held a service weapon she'd never need, and she was lifting out of it a rifle the like of which I had not seen outside the hands of the men we sent to the schools you don't talk about, a long, heavy, purpose-built thing, worn smooth at every contact point with the particular, where that only comes from 10,000 hours of a single pair of hands. She had her own data, the notebook, the card she'd built over hours, the densities and the wind zone and the times, and she laid it out beside the firing platform with the unhurried economy of a person who has done this under fire more times than she can count. And she said again, not to me, not to anybody, just to the valley. I can read it. Prout stared at her. You're the clerk, he said. He actually said that. With the lieutenant's voice on the radio and men bleeding in the wash, he looked at the rifle in her hands and the data on the ground and he said, You're the clerk. I am the one who answered him. I had been a fool for weeks, but I was not in the end a fool all the way down, and I had just watched my best shooter fail at the thing that mattered most. And behind me was a person opening a master's rifle with a master's hands and laying out the only range data on that ridge that reached past 2,000 meters, and the fog I'd been living in for a month finally tore. Get off the gun, I told Prout. Sergeant Calder, the hide's yours. She didn't thank me. She didn't look at Prout. She got down behind that rifle the way water finds its level, and the hide went quiet, and what happened in the next 11 minutes I have spent the rest of my life trying to describe to men who weren't there and falling short every time. The first thing she did was nothing. She lay behind the rifle and she did not fire and she did not touch the turrets and she watched. Through my own glass I watched the gut of the saddle with her, and I made myself read it the way she'd taught the page to read it, and I saw the mirage in the pinch boiling and shifting. The heat rolling off the valley floor and bending the light, the wind showing itself in the grass, and the dust, switching, lying, the same lie that had eaten 6 of Prout's rounds. She watched it for a long count. Down in the wash a man tried to drag a wounded comrade, and the counter-sniper put a round into the dirt by his hand, and he went flat again. "Near gun first," she said to me, because I was spotting now, and a shooter at this work needs a second pair of eyes and a voice she trusts, and for reasons I did not examine then she had decided to trust mine. 2800, the wind's the whole problem, it's 2 winds. There's a left to right down here off our shoulder, and there's a right to left coming up the far side, and they meet in the pinch and they fight, and the round has to cross both. Prout was reading the near wind and dialing for it, and the far wind was eating the correction. You have to split them. You hold for the fight, not for either wind. I did not fully understand what she was telling me. I understand it now. She was describing a thing most shooters never have to solve in a lifetime, a round that has to travel through 2 opposing wind fields and survive the seam where they collide, and she was describing it the way a carpenter describes a cut, plainly, because to her it was not magic, it was arithmetic she had done 10,000 times. She dialed the turrets. She read her own card, the densities, the time of morning, the temperature she'd written down at dawn out of habit weeks before she had any reason to. She built the firing solution out loud, half to me and half to herself, and there was no hurry in it and no fear in it. And that was the thing that finally broke something open in my chest. Watching her, there was no fear in it, with men dying in front of her, because fear is what fills the space where competence isn't. And she had filled every inch of that space with competence a long time ago, and there was simply no room left in her for fear. "Send it when you're ready," I said. My voice wasn't steady, hers was. She broke the shot. I had the near gun in my glass. I saw the round arrive. Across 2,800 meters of switching, fighting wind, that round crossed the seam of 2 opposing currents and came down into a machine gun position dug into the far ridge, and the gun stopped. It simply stopped. The hammering that had been pinning our men flat for 10 minutes ceased between one beat and the next, and in the wash and the sudden quiet of one gun gone silent, I saw men begin to move. "Hit," I said. My mouth was dry. "Near guns down. Good hit. Good, that's a good hit," Calder. She had already cycled the bolt. She was not listening to me praise her. She was reading the wind again, because the wind had moved the way it always moved, and the correction for the first shot was already wrong for the second. "Middle gun," she said. 2,900. Winds backed off in the pinch, coming off 2/10. She made a small adjustment, a quarter turn, nothing, the kind of refinement most shooters wouldn't believe could matter at that range, and that at that range is the entire difference between a hit and a corpse. She settled. She broke the shot. 2,900 meters away the second machine gun stopped firing. "Hit," I said, and now the word came out of me with something in it I hadn't felt in years, something I'd thought that country had burned out of me a long time before. Awe, the clean kind, the kind that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with watching a human being do a thing at the absolute outer edge of what a human being can do. Middle gun down. 2 guns silent. The grazing fire that had welded 22 men to the floor of the saddle was half gone, and in the wash the patrol was reorganizing, the lieutenant getting men up, beginning to move them back out of the pinch toward us, and for the first time since dawn there was a current of hope running up that valley. And then the 3rd gun shifted its fire to cover the patrol's withdrawal, and the counter-sniper, who had gone quiet while the guns did his work for him, began to hunt the moving men, and Calder had 2 targets left, and they were the 2 hard ones. "Far guns repositioned," I called. "Moved left into the rocks, hull down, I can barely see it. And the sniper, Calder, the sniper's working the patrol he's at, I can't range him clean." 3,200, she said. She had already found him, of course she had. While I was still fumbling with the gun, she had found the one shot on that whole ridge nobody else could have even attempted. The counter-sniper hide at 3,200 meters, and she'd ranged it and read it, and she was lying there as still water, deciding which of 2 men to kill first, with men's lives hanging on the order. "Take the gun," I said. "The gun's killing them now." "The sniper first," she said, quiet, certain. "The gun's spraying, he's aiming. Aimed fire kills the men who matter, the sniper first." I have thought about that decision more times than any other 30 seconds of my life. She was right. She was right in a way that I, with all my years, did not see until she said it, that the indiscriminate gun would wound and scatter, but the patient marksman would take the leaders and the radios and the strong ones, the men a unit cannot lose, and that the arithmetic of saving the most lives ran through the harder target. She made that call in the time it takes to draw a breath, with no one's permission, against my instinct, and she made it right. She settled in behind the rifle one more time. 3,200 meters, past 2,000 where nothing mattered. Through the seam of two winds and the boiling mirage of the pinch and the curve of the Earth's own air, at a man dug into rock so well I could barely hold him in a spotting scope, while the third gun hammered and the radio crackled and 22 men ran for their lives below us. Sergeant Wren Calder lay as still as a stone in a riverbed and read the air and did her arithmetic and waited for the wind to give her the half-second she needed. I did not breathe. I'll be honest with you, I, who had fired and called more shots than every other man on that ridge combined, I held my own breath as if it would help, as if the stillness of an old man's lungs could reach across 3 kilometers and steady around. She broke the shot. The wait at that range is forever. The round is in the air for the better part of 5 seconds, climbing and crossing and falling, and in those 5 seconds you cannot do one thing in the world but believe or not believe, and I watched through the glass and I believed. God help me, after a month of taking her for a clerk I believed all the way down, and the round came out of the sky at 3,200 meters and found the counter-sniper in his rocks and he was simply gone, and the hunting stopped. I made a sound, I'm not ashamed of it. Prout, behind me, made a sound too. And Calder cycled the bolt and read the wind and said, "Now the gun." And 40 seconds later the third machine gun, repositioned, hull down, barely visible in its rocks, stopped firing at 2,800 meters with one round, and the long saddle went quiet, the whole long pale length of it, quiet for the first time since dawn, and 22 men who had been nailed to the floor of that valley got up out of the wash and walked home. 11 minutes, 3 crude gun positions and a counter-sniper. 22 men out, every one of them the wounded carried by the whole, not a man left in the saddle. I have done this work my entire life and I had never seen its equal and I have never seen its equal since, and I had been letting the woman who did it carry the logbook and boil the coffee for a month. She got up off the rifle. She did not whoop. She did not look at Prout, who could not look at her. She did not look at me with any "I told you so" in her pale eyes, because she had never told us so, not once, not even when I drew her a fool that third morning over her own range card. She knelt down and she began methodically to clean her rifle, because the rifle had done good work and the rifle came first, and her hands were perfectly steady, and I realized, watching those steady hands, that they had been perfectly steady the entire time through all 11 minutes while mine had not. I want to tell you the next part carefully because it is the part that matters, the part the whole thing was always about. There is a thing we do in this work after a shot like that. We confirm it and we record it. The data book is the ledger of truth and a confirmed engagement at extreme range. The conditions, the ranges, the rounds, the results gets entered into the official record, signed and witnessed. Because it is data, and because it is honor, and because 100 years from now some young shooter ought to be able to open a book and see that on a bad morning above the long saddle a human being made these shots in these conditions, so that he believes it can be done, so that he reaches for it. The signing of the record is not paperwork. It is the closest thing my profession has to a sacrament. By rights and by regulation, the senior man on the ridge enters and signs that record. That was me. And there had been a month right up until that morning when if I had signed a record like that I'd have signed it for Prout, the best natural shooter I'd ever trained and never thought twice. I took the official book to where Calder knelt cleaning her rifle. The whole section had come up into the hide by then, the line platoon 2 word travels, and they stood in a half circle, all of them, the men who had watched Prout fail and then watched the clerk do the impossible, and they were dead silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses on your ears. I knelt down across from her. I opened the official record on my knee. And I did the thing that, of everything I did in 40 years of soldiering, I am proudest of, and it is not a thing I did with a rifle. I wrote it down. In my own hand while she watched, I entered the engagement, the date, the conditions, the wind, the 2 opposing fields and the seam, the densities off her own card, the 4 targets, the ranges, 2,800, 2,900, 3,200, 2,800. The 3,200-meter shot on the counter-sniper I underlined, because in the ledger of my whole career it was the finest single shot I had ever witnessed, and the ledger is the ledger of truth. And then, where the senior man signs to confirm and witness, I signed my name. And under it, where the shooter's name goes, I did not write Prout, and I did not leave it for someone else, and I did not hand her the pen to write her own. I wrote it myself. I wrote in the record in my own hand the name and the call sign, because by then I knew the call sign. She'd given it to me quietly while she cleaned the rifle when I asked her plainly what I should write, and she'd told me the way she told me everything, without weight, as if it were nothing. Stillwater. I had heard that call sign. Every shooter in the sector had heard that call sign. There was a record attached to that call sign, a confirmed shot, a number that men in this trade said out loud the way you say the name of a mountain you'll never climb, and we had all of us assumed the person behind it was something other than a quiet woman who'd spent a month boiling our coffee and saying, "All right, top," when an old fool sneered at her. I wrote Stillwater in the record under my own signature. And then I closed the book and I stood up, and in front of the whole section and the whole platoon, I came to attention and I rendered her a salute. I had not saluted a junior in rank in 30 years. The salute does not run that direction, that is the whole architecture of the thing. But there are debts the architecture doesn't cover, and respect, the real kind, the forced kind, the kind that rips your assumptions out by the root and leaves you standing in the wreck of who you thought you were, that kind does not check the chevrons. I held the salute. And after a long moment Sergeant Calder set down the cleaning rod and she stood and she returned it plainly with no triumph in it, the way she did everything. Behind me I heard the section come to attention, all of them, Prout last and slowest because it cost him the most, because he was a proud man who had just learned what it costs to have never been humbled, but he came to it, and he held it, and there were tears standing in his eyes that he was too good a soldier to let fall. And then Prout did the thing that told me he was going to be, in the end, a better man than the shooter I'd thought was my best. When the patrol's wounded had come up the path and been seen to, and the section began to break down the hide and move down off the ridge, Prout walked over to where Stillwater's rifle case lay in its place, the same case he'd dumped in the dirt a month before, the same gear he'd shoved aside to make room for the real shooters, and without a word, without being asked, he picked it up and he carried it, carefully, the way some men carry a sleeping child. The way she had carried it up the path the day she arrived, the day I'd looked at a master and seen a clerk. He carried her case all the way down off Greyridge, a half step behind her, and not one man in the section said a word about it, and not one man ever forgot it. I am an old man now, and I have told this story more times than I can count, to young shooters mostly, the ones who think they've already got it figured, the ones with the gift and the safety off, the Prouts before they've been humbled. And every time I tell it I end it the same way because it is the only ending that is true. We didn't make her. That's the thing the young ones always get wrong when they hear it. They think the story is about how she earned our respect, like respect was ours to give and she finally did enough to deserve it. That's not the story. She didn't earn anything that morning. She was Stillwater the day she stepped off that bird. She was the finest shooter I will ever stand beside before I ever handed her a logbook, before I asked her if she was admin, before Prout dumped her gear in the dirt. Nothing she did on the long saddle made her anything she wasn't already. All it did was tear the blindness off the rest of us. The respect wasn't something we gave her. It was something she forced out of us, against our pride and against our certainty, by being so completely and quietly what she was that in the end there was nothing left for us to do but record it in the book and stand at attention before it. And I signed that record myself in my own hand, an old fool who'd been wrong about almost nothing else in 40 years and dead wrong about her. Because the book is the ledger of truth, and the truth, that morning, was that the best shooter on that ridge had been keeping our score the whole time, and we'd never once looked up from our own reflection long enough to see her. I keep a copy of that page, I've carried it for years. The conditions, the wind, the seam where two winds fight, the ranges climbing out past 2,000 to where I'd told her nothing mattered, 28, 29, 3200 and the one underline and my signature, and under it the name and the call sign in my own hand. Stillwater. I was wrong about her? I said that at the start and I'll say it again at the end because a man who tells you a story like this one ought to begin and end by admitting where he was a fool. I looked at a master and I saw a clerk. I handed her a logbook and told her to keep score. And she kept it, she kept all of it. And on a bad morning above the long saddle she opened the book on 22 men's lives and balanced it, every name, every one of them home, and then she knelt down and cleaned her rifle while an old man who should have known better learned, far too late, the difference between the men you bury and the ones you stand for. I stood for her, I stand for her still. And if you ever find yourself looking at the quiet one in the back of the hide, the one keeping the book, the one you've already decided you've measured, son, do me the one favor this whole long story is for. Look again.